What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. Today's video, I'm going to be building this maple and steel coffee table, actually a pair of coffee tables. So this is inspired by a room and board design, just a beautiful, simple design. And this video is going to be split into two parts. So in part one, I'm going to be building the maple tops, which will include milling and ripping and basically getting everything glued up and smoothed out and ready to go. And then in part two, we'll build the steel bases and then get the tops and bases attached and finally assembled. So stay tuned, part two will be out next Tuesday, so stick around for that, and let's go ahead and get started.
So I built this project out of 8/4 or 2-inch thick hard maple. If you want to build these tables, it's best to look for boards that are at least 8 inches wide just to help reduce waste. If you wanted to build this on more of a budget, 2x10s from your local home center would be a great inexpensive option as well. You could process them in basically the same way and end up with a very similar table. The first step in breaking down the maple was cutting the boards into more manageable pieces on the miter saw. Since the final table size was 29 inches square, I cut my pieces to around 30 inches long, leaving just enough extra length for trimming to final length later on. These boards were already relatively flat and were skip planed at the mill, so next I jointed one edge on the joiner to square it up with the face of the board. After squaring up at the jointer, I ripped the boards in half at the table saw. Now, if your boards have a lot of tension in them, it's probably best to rip them at the bandsaw, but my boards were relatively tension free and ripped very easily on the table saw. These boards were a little over 8 inches wide, so I cut them to about 4 inches wide at this point, and the final thickness of the tops ended up at about 3 3/4 of an inch. So this hard maple is incredibly dense wood, and you can see just how heavy it is with me struggling just to push the pile over. I definitely did not need to go to the gym the week I built these tables. Moving these tops around was incredibly difficult. So with all the pieces cut to their rough size, I squared them up on all sides, starting on the jointer. I flattened one face and then squared up one edge to that face before moving on to the planer. At the planer, I smoothed out each board, bringing them down to their final thickness of roughly 1 3/4 inches. After each pass through the planer, I checked the faces of the boards and flipped the boards that already had one smooth face. By taking relatively even amounts off of each side of the boards have less pronounced bowing due to fresh surfaces being exposed than if you just took a lot of wood off of one face. Once both faces of all the boards were completely smooth, I ripped them to final width at the table saw. So while I'm ripping, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, SawStop. I've had a SawStop table saw in my shop for about 6 months, and I would never go back to another table saw. The added safety and peace of mind while I'm working in my shop alone is really unparalleled. So now, through the end of April 2017, SawStop is offering a free upgrade on new professional cabinet saw purchases. In the US and Canada, each customer who purchases a new professional cabinet saw will receive one of 2 available accessories, the Overarm Dust Collection or the Integrated Mobile Base, each worth $199 US. SawStop saws pretty much never go on sale, so if you've been on the fence, definitely jump on this promotion and you'll get $199 of accessories free of charge. So to learn more, check out the link in the video description below. So with all the boards to their final dimension, I cut them all to their final length at the miter saw. I squared up one end of the board, flipped it around, then cut the board to its final length, roughly 29 inches. Having a stop block on your miter saw here is extremely helpful since there are a lot of cuts to be made. Next, I arranged the boards how I wanted them in the final top, making sure any imperfections were facing down. I also tried to arrange the colors of the boards to look fairly similar. To make sure I put the boards back in the same orientation, I also drew a triangle across the entire face of the table. One of the design elements of these tables are the bolts and nuts that are recessed into the sides of the table. There are probably a lot of ways to do this, but I decided to go all out and use all thread running through the entire length of the tops. To make sure all my holes lined up properly, I set up a stop block on my drill press. For the 3/4 inch washers I used, I needed a 2-inch hole to recess the washer and nut in, and for this I used a Forstner bit. I drilled these holes first, only on the 2 outside faces of the tabletops. Next, for the 3/4 inch all thread to run through, I drilled 1-inch holes in every piece of the tabletop. And this extra little wiggle room helped to account for any slight errors in the drilling. There was a ton of drilling, and my drill press definitely got quite the workout that day. So next I rounded over the edges of all the holes inside the top, and this helped to remove any of the kind of hanging pieces left by the drill press that would have caused gaps in the glue up. And to help keep all the boards aligned during glue up, I cut biscuit slots in each board, and this really helped to keep the top mostly flat during the glue up. So for the glue up, I used a foam roller to get an even layer of glue on the face of each board. Then I added the biscuits and then just basically repeated this until I was done. So there were 17 boards on this glue up, and I still managed to get them all in the clamps in under 10 minutes. Really planning out your glue ups makes them a lot less stressful, and this could have been a super stressful glue up if I had not really planned things out. Once the glue dried, I roughly flattened the bottom of the table using a low angle jack plane. I don't have a jointer plane, otherwise I would have used that here, and basically the longer the plane, the better here. And with the bottom roughly flat, I took the top to the drum sander and got it totally flat. If you don't have a drum sander, you could use a belt sander and a straight edge to accomplish the same thing, or if your hand plane skills are better than mine, you can flatten the top as well with a plane. Once the top was completely flat, I squared up the edges of the top. I used a track saw for this, but a circular saw with a straight edge would work just as well. Since the tops are so thick, I had to make a pass on one side, flip the top, and then make a pass from the other side. And if you take your time laying out your marks, you should end up with a fairly even surface, but you'll probably still need to clean it up a little bit. And again, I used the low angle jack plane for this. With one side squared up, you just do the same thing on the other end of the table to get the top totally square. Next came lots and lots of sanding. So hard maple is really hard stuff, as the name implies, so sanding takes a while, especially on the end grain on the two edges of the table. And I started with 80 grit and worked my way up to 180. Before sanding to my final grit, I rounded over all the edges of the tabletops with a 3/8 inch radius roundover bit. And this really gives the top a nice look, and if you happen to bump an edge with your knee or shin, it'll hurt a lot less than if the edges were still left sharp. I smoothed out all the roundovers with 180 grit and also added an 1/8 inch radius roundover to the recesses for the bolts and sanded those as well. Once all the sanding was done, it was time to apply finish. I went with a water-based polyurethane for this table, since they'll see a good bit of wear with coffee cups and drinks and that kind of thing. Also, big shout out to my friends at the Modern Maker podcast. They're a new podcast that is absolutely killing it. Definitely check them out if you haven't already heard of them. I'll have a link in the video description.
And then put the person's name and address real big so that it can embarrass them.
Yes.
Yeah, that's funny.
So I applied 4 coats in total, sanding with 400 grit in between, and with the finish applied, the tabletops were done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed part 1 of this build. This was a lot of work, a lot of repetitive processes. If you wanted to build this and kind of keep the budget down, I know hard maple is kind of a more expensive wood. You could build this from like 2x10s from your home center, southern yellow pine, and you could probably get all of this wood for less than 50, 60 bucks. So that's a great way to go if you want to stick to a more budget-friendly wood for this. So again, part 2 will be out next week. I'll be building the steel bases and getting everything buttoned up. So stay tuned for that. If you're not already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this every Tuesday. Also, I have links in the video description to all the products I used in the video. And last, if you want to support me a little further, see some behind the scenes content, check me out on Patreon. I'll have a link to that for you to go check out. Thanks again for watching, guys, and until next time, happy building.